Today I'm talking to Art Bohart, who tomorrow in fact is going to be going to the BAPCA conference in Cirencester, where he'll be giving a keynote entitled Journey to the Heart of Person-Centered Therapy. And Art's most well-known book is the 1999 book How Clients Make Therapy Work, which he co-authored with Karen Tallman. So Art, welcome to the UK.
Thank you.
I've got 4 questions for you, and you may want to divert from these. Please do so as much as you want. My first question is, what originally drew you to client-centered therapy, or as we in the UK would call it, person-centered therapy?
Well, actually, I started out mostly as an existentialist. And philosophically, I liked the existential point of view, with all its emphasis on human self-creation, in effect, and finding meaning and things like that. And then I liked it philosophically, but I couldn't find a method that fit with it. And so when I was trying to do therapy as a graduate student, I really didn't have a very good feel for what I was doing. And what happened was I read an article by Eugene Gendlin called The Experiential Response. And in it he gives what amounts to nice specific directions for doing empathic reflecting. And I don't mean the way it's typically taught. I meant more in terms of the sense of it or the meaning of it. And I went in to see my client the next day, who was about a 10-year-old boy and was acting out. And I tried doing empathic reflecting like he said, and it worked fantastically well. And my supervisor, who was watching through the one-way mirror, when I came out, he said, "That's therapy, that's therapy." and literally one session, and the following week the mother said, "I don't know what you did, but he's been so much better." And I started to, so then I got interested in Gendlin, and it actually took me to Rogers. And I had read Rogers before, but and I agreed with all the ideas, but I didn't. So what am I doing while I'm being more empathic and genuine? I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing. And Gendlin gave me a sense of what to do.
Right.
And at that point, I did not interpret him the way that he has subsequently been interpreted. I interpreted him mainly as, in terms of doing empathic reflecting, of giving you a guideline of how to tune into a person.
Right.
And not necessarily this idea that you're supposedly enhancing experiencing. I thought it was more of a guideline of how to listen. And it really helped me. And so then I got back involved with Rogers, and it just fit with me. The whole idea, it just fit perfectly with the experiences I had had with all my clients, where I had repeatedly seen that if you responded to them as persons, they grew. And if you responded to them as specimens, they didn't. And then the other thing is that I had been myself in psychoanalytic therapy for 2 years because of a severe anxiety problem I had. And my therapist was a very nice fellow, and I liked him. He was considered a very good analyst. But that way of relating to yourself, which comes out of that approach to therapy, which is very much to kind of look at yourself as a specimen, was very non-productive for me. And I had gone to see a Jungian analyst subsequently who I didn't know at the time, but he practiced as a Rogerian, basically. And that really helped me. And so putting that all together, putting my experiences with my clients together with my own personal experience with what happened when I started using some of Jenlen's ideas. It just was very clear to me that that was my home, you know, and it had to do with the whole idea of responding to people with trust is the bottom line, and that was what was therapeutic.
What's interesting to me when you say that is that I've heard so many people describe a similar process of their own experiences in therapy, some reading and an aha moment, and then reflecting on how to apply this to their own professional work, and all of those things coming together. It seems such a everybody's story is unique, but at the same time it seems like a road well travelled.
Very interesting. Yeah.
So, well, thank you for that. Now the next question is, and I'm going to, well, I'm not timing you on this, but in 10 minutes, how would you summarise the most important learnings from your work and research on client self-healing?
Certainly to go through the I'll just give the argument, which is that we happened on the idea, Karen and myself, through two sources. One was that we did a little research study where I was at the time very influenced by a later interpretation of Jenlen's work, which I know we're going to get to in another question, so I'll pass on that right now. But it was the idea of enhancing experiencing, and I was very much into that. And so we did a little research study where we gave volunteer clients, one session kind of analog research where they talked about a problem, a real problem, but obviously not a terribly deep problem. And we gave them what we called good experiential empathy responses or bad experiential empathy responses. And bad meant not harmful, but just simply sort of vapid. The difference between clients saying, I'm really angry, and the therapist saying, you're angry, as opposed to saying something like, you know, it really gets your goat, or something a little more evocative. And we tape recorded the sessions, and what we found was that the clients would work with the bad empathy responses to save the interaction, and they would actually also in this process save the face of the therapist. So they would do something like, they'd say, well, yeah, and then they would go off in their own direction, which really didn't have much to do with what the therapist had said, but they would save the face of the therapist. So they were actually being creatively generative in making the therapy work. And that fit with a lot of David Rennie's research. And it was just so clear cut that they were active agents. They're not just receiving, and interventions are not operating on them. They are actively, they're as active as the therapist is. There's two therapists in the room. They're as active as the therapist is in actively working on the therapist's responses to make them work for themselves. And so that was one thing. And then the other thing was all the research that showed that all the therapies worked about equally well. There was research coming out that showed that clients were doing about as well with self-help techniques as with professional therapy. And it became very clear to us that the most parsimonious explanation was, how could it be that people in Rogerian therapy, psychodynamic, and cognitive behavioral, all so different, are doing as well? It's the client who's actively, like I said, actively taking what the therapist is doing, no matter what it is, and turning it into gold. And so that was the number one learning, I think, is that the client is an active, generative agent who is taking the materials the therapist is providing, and almost like an artist turning them into something useful.
I'm wondering whether the therapist is necessary at all then?
Well, I'll say two things about that. One is the studies on self-help that showed that self-help works as good as professionally provided therapy, or almost as good. It's not quite, but it's close.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, there was always a therapist who was monitoring them. Maybe not spending more than 10 minutes a week talking to them, but there was always some contact. And I personally think that self-help material can work, but the trouble is that people don't stick with it. And in these were all randomized controlled studies. In those, you had somebody always kind of making sure the person did it. Mm. So I think that there was evidence that clients really can do on their own that way. However, there was also some evidence in one study that clients don't like it as much as talking to a therapist. And I think that my guess is that there's learnings going on talking to a therapist that don't have to simply do with symptom reduction. And these studies were all, like usually with symptom reduction.
Right, yeah.
But yes, compliance, I think, if you can get clients actively motivated to stay with a self-help program, I think that many can do it on their own. I'm not convinced everyone can.
Right.
But I think many can.
Okay. It seems to be moving towards an explanation for why people improve on wait lists and
right, exactly.
Going up a mountain or going to church. I suppose church is a bad example because there are many potentially healing relationships to be had in a community like that.
Right,
but
exactly.
Certainly to kickstart your own self-healing process in a moment of solitude is not an unknown experience. So. Yeah,
I really, people do, for want of a better term, self-heal all the time outside. When I've started teaching this to students, I'll often ask them to recall an incident where they got over something without a professional therapist.
Yeah.
The only thing I want to say about that is what I don't like about that is the implication that some could draw that therefore why should you go to a therapist? In other words, is there something really wrong with you that you have to go to a therapist? And what I've found is that you can't make that kind of conclusion. I mean, in my own life, I had two major problems. One of them, my anxiety, I got over by myself. And when I got divorced, I developed a drinking problem. My anxiety I got over with a therapist. And when I got divorced, I developed a drinking problem. And that pretty much I got over by myself. I think that from comparing those two, I still don't know why I got over one by myself and the other I really did need a therapist. But I think it's we don't know enough to know what's the difference. Sure. But clearly people need therapists, and clearly it doesn't necessarily have to do with the severity of the problem or anything wrong with them. I suspect it's circumstances. I suspect it's a lot circumstances.
Yeah. I like the idea that there's an awful lot we don't know. That fits with my model of the world. Okay, let me move on. Now, over the years, I've heard you speak positively about both classical non-directive client-centered therapy and been very supportive, and about newer developments, and you seem to stand in between the two. I want to call them sides, but I don't want to give the impression that they're in any kind of conflict or battle, even though sometimes it looks like that.
Sometimes it is.
Yeah, I was trying not to go there. It looks an uncomfortable place to be, and I'm wondering how you find it and what your experience of being the man in the middle. might be.
Well, let me again go back to the Genlin thing, because when I first ran into Genlin, I just simply saw him as deepening client-centered theory. And then later I started getting influenced by the idea of more deliberately engineering clients' experience, which I think Genlin, I don't want to speak for Genlin. I don't know how much he encouraged that, or some of his followers encouraged that, but the idea then came to be that it wasn't so much that you tuned into clients experiencing as a way of hearing them, as it was that you were trying to enhance their experiencing. And that is more, you see that idea more in the experiential therapies, and I got very much into that. And I was into that until 1988 at the Live-In Conference, when Barbara Broadley spoke up in one of her talks and said that Genlin's approach was different than client-centered, and I was absolutely shocked. And it took me a long time to assimilate that, but I finally decided that she was right. And I then decided, I agreed with her, because she also said that there was a family of person-centered therapies, and that client-centered therapy was one member and Genlin's focusing approach was another member. And I came to believe that. And as I worked with it, I ended up moving actually more towards her direction, though probably not completely. But I believe that that person-centered therapy, the key idea is that you do follow the client, and the client is the boss, and the client knows what helps and what hurts and what heals and so on. And everything that you give them is an offering, it's not an expert intervention. And so as I moved toward that, I then started to have to reconstruct or rethink a lot of my interest in more of the experiential stuff. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up with my own integrative point of view, which is basically that it's not what you do so much as how you do it, and that you can certainly not merely offer a technique to a client when they ask for one, which is what some of the more classical people say, but you can offer it relying on the client's active, creative, self-healing tendencies and their ability to say yes or no. I can think of clients I've had who actively want my input so they can think about it, and they don't feel shut down by it at all. And so it's how you do it and the kind of relationship that you and them create together. And so with that in mind, I do end up somewhere in the middle. I actually, my heart still is really toward the more classical way. But honestly, if I could practice just doing empathic reflections, that would be the way that would fit me the most. But I really, on top of my theoretical interests, I really have run into too many clients, for whatever reasons, who want other things. Mm. And I feel that to honor them and their intelligence is to do that. I had a client who wanted, first he wanted some of the emotion-focused things, and then he wanted some cognitive things, and so we did all of those, you know. Mm-hmm. And but he was the one who was deciding if they worked or not. So so that was, you know, so I ended up with my integrated point of view, and but I still maintain my interest and allegiance to the experiential people, because I do believe that their hearts are still mostly in the person-centered, and especially, like we were talking, some of them particularly who in practice actually practice kind of more like the way I'm talking. You know, there are the protocols, but they apply the protocol sensitively, and they do it in response to the client. And I think, for instance, emotion-focused therapy could be applied mechanistically, and then it wouldn't be person-centered. But I actually think you could do emotion-focused therapy in a person-centered way, which I think,
Right.
various people do. And especially that's true also, I think, of Jenlin's focusing-oriented approach. So I don't know if that's answered it very well. I think there's enormous insights to be gained from the. I think Les Greenberg's work gives enormous insights into client self-healing processes, and if you're a person-centered therapist, studying that stuff can only expand your ability to empathically listen and to hear your client and respond, even if you don't become an emotion-focused therapist. And the focusing technique, if you force a client to do it, then you're not being person-centered. But if you offer it and the client likes it, I can't see how it can't be person-centered. I mean, it's the client doing it. So I'm not systematically use those things, either one of them. I don't do the two-chair very often, and I don't use focusing very often. But I don't.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the way you're talking now, it really it takes me along the path of thinking that cognitive and behavioural therapy can be done in a person-centred way, and there are many elements of theory, more recent developments in cognitive theory that map with only minor changes in language onto person-centred theory. And then the question is, well, how do people actually practice that in the moment? And some of the cognitive therapists I've got to know over the years, I really think they are very person-centred. And I wouldn't like to have to decide whether they passed or failed, let me put it like that. So it can sometimes be just down to a matter of vocabulary. And then at other times, I think it's possible to practice person-centred therapy in a very instrumental and mechanised way. And we would all recognise that as poor therapy, regardless. And maybe even the cognitive therapist would also. Who knows? So.
In John Wood's book, where the collection of his papers, he says pretty much that same thing. I wrote a review of it, and I forget the exact wording, but he pretty much said that a lot of classical person-centered therapists, when they started doing some of the group work that Rogers was doing and John Wood was doing, they discovered that their method of empathic reflecting was a method, and they hadn't really recognized that it was a real method before, and that they, in some sense, they were, for want of a better word, sort of imposing it on their clients. So I think it can be done in a mechanistic and non-responsive way, and then it just becomes another expert therapist stance in a funny kind of way.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to give you an opportunity to sound off a bit. I know that you're not a fan of evidence-based practice and the research methods. I'm wondering if you could spend a little bit of time saying what your objections are, since in this country we appear to have followed the American set of processes, and we now end up with a government body which adjudicates what may or may not be practiced in certain circumstances in the National Health Service based on randomised controlled trials and the kind of evidence that you clearly do not favour. What is it that you object to?
Well, actually that's a very complex question. I'll try to give it very as succinct as I can. First of all, in the United States now, there's a distinction between empirically supported treatments and evidence-based practice. And I am in favor of evidence-based practice. I think that we should use evidence and be guided by evidence, but the key issue becomes what kind of evidence. And the American Psychological Association has now adopted a much broader statement on how evidence should be incorporated. And that's another issue. It's not just whether you use evidence, it's how do you use evidence. Do you use preset treatment protocols that have been manualized and have been tested in randomized controlled trials, which is the empirically supported treatments approach? Or is the practitioner more like an architect who uses evidence? If the architect doesn't use science, his buildings will fall down. But nonetheless has to creatively blend the evidence with the individual situation he or she is working with. And there are other approaches to evidence-based practice where you certainly base your practice in evidence, but you don't use manualized treatment protocols. So I actually made a presentation at an APA convention on evidence-based practice on this very thing. And what I said is that a humanistic approach to therapy, the way you use evidence is, first of all, you rely on the evidence on empirically supported relationships, which is that there's considerable evidence that responding in a way that's empathic with unconditional positive regard and so on is therapeutic. So right away, if you're doing that, you're already practicing in an evidence-based fashion. Secondly, you can use what are called principles, empirically supported principles. So for instance, according to Klaus Grave from Switzerland, providing mastery experiences is an evidence-based practice. Well, person-centered therapists unequivocally provide mastery experiences. Another one is it's called problem actuation, according to Grave, which is that the client has to experience the problem live in therapy. Well, that happens if any client gets deeply involved. So there are ways of being evidence-based that don't involve having to use this or that protocol. And the current APA standard allows you to practice in that way. Now that's still under heavy attack in the United States from the empirically supported treatments people who are outraged that APA came up with this. And it's a very nasty battle, but the irony of it all is that David Barlow, who is the fellow who started all this when he was president of the clinical psychology division, and he's the guy that started the empirically supported treatments thing. He's a cognitive behaviorist. He now believes that in terms of CBT practice, you should follow principles of practice rather than specific protocols. But that's my main answer to that. Is that empirically supported treatments are a narrow way of looking at evidence, and there's a huge amount of evidence that supports other ways of practicing, and it's bad science. Bluntly, it's bad science. And on top of it, the newest thing is the whole feedback outcomes management thing, where if you have clients fill out little scales at the end of sessions, and then you perhaps discuss the scale with them at the beginning of the next session, your outcomes go way up, and the effect is much more powerful than the use of empirically supported manualized treatments. And it doesn't matter what you're practicing. And it fits perfectly with, there's nothing that would stop a person-centered therapist from doing that, and it fits perfectly with the idea of client as active self-healer, getting them actively involved. So that would be my answer to that.
So that's Scott Miller's work, isn't it? The feedback-informed treatment stuff that we people that are watching this, I'd encourage them to look at Scott Miller's website, where there's a lot of information about that.
Or Barry Duncan.
So okay, that's fascinating, and I suppose it's a sensitive subject over here because we do have, as I say, a government organisation, NICE, who issues protocols for clinical psychologists and psychotherapists, regarding what is a recommended treatment and what is not a recommended treatment. And the recommended treatments are ones that have an evidence base that is empirically supported, with the top line evidence being randomised controlled trials, and very little is recommended if it doesn't have randomised controlled trials backing it up. It's a bone of contention, as you can imagine. So interesting to hear you say, hear you talk about that.
Well, I think I'm not the only one who would believe this. What I said, David Orlinsky, who many would probably consider the dean of psychotherapy researchers, has openly said that the empirically supported treatments thing, I'm not quoting him exactly, but basically it's bad science.
Mm.
And I honestly think that is bad science. It's not. It's not scientific to restrict practice in that way.
Mm. And that is the effect, of course. It narrows down the provision, prevents therapists from being creative in their application if they're supposed to be following a manual. It doesn't feel good practice, let alone good science.
Right.
Okay, one last question. I don't know the extent to which this applies in the United States, but certainly in the United Kingdom, client-centred therapy has been in decline for a number of years now, with the advent of cognitive behavioural therapy. Do you think anything can be done to reinstate client-centred and person-centred therapy as a mainstream therapy? And if so, what?
I really don't know. I pondered that a lot, and I wonder if there's just a natural evolution of things, and that maybe there will be no way to reinstate it, but what will happen is it will show up again in a new form in the not too distant future. I think one of my colleagues, Maureen O'Hara, has been very, very encouraged by things like the recovery movement and things like that, where the consumer movement, it might be called over here, where consumers are actively taking more and more of a role in their own treatment, and their principles, the principles of the recovery movement in the United States, are all person-centered. And I think that one way I think she would suggest, and I would probably suggest too, would be for person-centered people to more actively align themselves with that movement, and because we're brothers and sisters under the skin, and I think that is one way, and I don't have any other brilliant ideas other than I've said to some of my friends that we're like an underground movement at the current time, but you keep it alive until it's the time for it to come back out. And there will be another time. We're in a conservative time now in general, and there will be a time when there will be a new generation that's going to come along and find those ideas interesting again. So I say keep it alive, and
okay. We'll keep the flame alive in our little private shrines,
right,
ready to set the world on fire again,
right,
when the time is right.
Right.
Thanks very much, Art.
Okay.